Hi everybody, it's DrBiology here, and this video is about evolution and a bit about speciation. So this is related to a series of videos I'm doing on inheritance, variation and evolution. Just a reminder, so I'll go through most of the content you require for AQA GCSE Biology and for Combined Science, and then we're going to have a look at some questions. So I'm going to give you some question checkpoints. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first question to ask is, what is evolution? Well, evolution refers to the fact that all organisms today evolved from the first simple life forms that existed on Earth 3 billion years ago. Over time, organisms have generally got bigger and more complex, and as the environment has changed, new species have evolved. Now, what we need to think about is, well, how has that process of evolution occurred? So there are many different theories of evolution, but one of the main theories and the most important theory comes from this man here, who is Charles Darwin, who was born in 1809 and 1882, and he came up with the theory of natural selection. He came up with that idea over many years of observation and experiments, and one of the main observations he made was when he was a young man. He went on a voyage. In this voyage he was employed as the on-board naturalist, and it was a 5-year voyage, and he spent many years around South America, and particularly the Galapagos Islands. Now, the Galapagos Islands are a set of islands off the coast of South America, particularly Ecuador. The Galapagos Islands, over time, people believe that it has moved away from the mainland, so got separated from the mainland, and there were some common ancestors there. So there are some species that are similar to what you can find in South America and on the Galapagos Islands. However, there are species that seem to have adapted depending on where they live, so which island that they live on. Now, Darwin noticed that there are many differences between different species on different islands, and he noticed, for example, in the finch family of birds, he noticed, for example, here, finch number 1 had a thick set bill, and that allowed it to crack nuts, and that was on one of the islands, whereas another island you'd have a similar finch, number 4, with a very thin beak and able to go into nooks and crannies and to eat insects. So that got him thinking, well, how on earth did these changes develop? How did the finch have a common ancestor and become adapted to their environments? He also looked at things like tortoises. He did a lot of work as well when he was back home in terms of work on earthworms and other species at the time. So if you would like to know a tiny bit more about Charles Darwin and his life, then please type in Google search or check in DrBiology for Charles Darwin top 3 reasons, and he's in as one of my greatest biologists. So let's talk about his main theory. So his main theory was of natural selection. So firstly, there is variation within a species. Those organisms better adapted will be able to survive and reproduce and pass on the successful genes. And this is called survival of the fittest, or he named it survival of the fittest. Beneficial characteristics become more common in the population, and the species changes and it evolves. This process is called natural selection. So where does the evidence for this evolution come from? Evidence for this theory? Well, Darwin's theory is based on lots of observations and evidence, and much of that body of evidence is widely accepted today. And there are certain things that Darwin wouldn't have known about, which was genes and genetics, but this has really proven his theories of natural selection as being correct. So the discovery of genes and genetics, characteristics are controlled by genes, and we know that mutations cause genetic variation, and so the mechanism for species adaptation. And secondly, the fossil record. So whilst not complete, it does show how much or how little organisms have changed or evolved over time. So in your exam, you'll need to know a bit about fossils. So we'll look at fossils and the fossil record. So these are remains of organisms from millions of years ago, and they are found in rocks. So fossils are formed in three particular ways. Firstly, the gradual replacement by minerals. So hard parts like teeth, shell and bones, they won't decay and they last a long period of time. So if the conditions are correct, they'll be buried and they therefore will not be further decayed, and the minerals in the soil, so rock minerals, will replace the bone and form a rock-like substance shaped like the original hard part. Secondly is casts and impressions. So if an organism dies in a very soft material like clay, the clay hardens and the organisms then decay and they leave a cast of themselves. So you can get things like footprints, plant roots, leaves, and lots of different impressions of a species. And thirdly, preservation in places where no decay happens. So for example, in amber, in peat bogs, tar pits, frozen glaciers, there is no oxygen or moisture. So decay microbes can't survive and therefore the animal or organism is preserved. So when an organism dies, it could get buried, okay? So when it gets buried, as more and more soil and rock replaces that over time, you get a layering effect. And you tend to find fossils in things like sedimentary rocks, which are layered rocks. So if we look further down the rocks, we're looking at millions of years ago, and scientists have found that there are simpler life forms. You find much simpler life forms in older rock, whereas rocks that are recent or to the present day, you find fossils that are more complex. So, however, the fossil record is not a complete record, and this is due to several reasons. So firstly, many early life forms were soft-bodied, so things like jellyfish, algae, bacteria, so therefore they would not have left a trace. Secondly, the majority of fossils will have been destroyed by geological activity, including the things like formations of mountains, erosion, volcanoes and earthquakes. And thirdly, when an organism dies, the conditions weren't right, okay? So there might have been rapid decay or destruction of the bones or the teeth or the hard parts of the fossil. And then lastly, many fossils are still to be found. So whilst the fossil record is not complete, it may be more complete in the future. It's really important to understand that extinction has occurred over the life of species on this planet. Scientists believe that there have been at least 6 major extinction events. So extinction is when no individuals of a species remain. So the fossil record contains many species that don't exist anymore. And this is due to different factors. These include environment changes quickly. So, for example, there might be an ice age or there might be global warming. Secondly, you've got new predators that have evolved and adapted and therefore they wipe out a species. You might have new diseases forming. They may not be able to compete with other species that are more well adapted for food and therefore they can become extinct. And also a catastrophic event. This next section is for GCSE Biology only, and we need to look a bit more behind the theories of evolution because, as I stated earlier, there were lots of different ideas about evolution in the 19th century and beyond. So obviously you can look at this timeline and you can see that Darwin published his famous book on the origin of species in 1859, but many people before him had had some ideas about evolution. One of the key things you need to understand is about the ideas of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, or Lamarck. And he mainly based his ideas on that changes occur in an organism during its lifetime can be inherited by its offspring. So he called this what we call an acquired characteristic. So he used the idea of a giraffe, and he said that the original short-necked ancestor would have to stretch their necks to get higher up on the tree to get the food. Now, he suggested that that stretching caused the neck to get longer over many different generations. However, his theories were discredited through experimentation. Now, Darwin, he published his ideas on the origin of species in 1859. Before that, it took him a long period of time to publish, and he wasn't going to publish until he received a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, who was another scientist who had a very similar ideas to his. However, we need to understand that the theory of evolution by natural selection was only gradually accepted, and because of these main points. So first of all, the theory did challenge the idea at the time that God made all of the animals and plants that live on Earth. That's known as creationism. There was insufficient evidence at the time the theory was published to convince many scientists. So much of his evidence was observational, and he had lots of evidence, but not specific evidence of how natural selection came about. Thirdly, the mechanism of inheritance and variation was not known until at least 50 years after the theory was published. So, on to speciation. So speciation explains why over time different organisms may evolve. Now this is also in combined science, this part. So first of all, we need to know what a species is. So a species is a group of similar organisms that give rise to fertile offspring. So fertile meaning that they can then go on and have their own offspring. Now, the example I've given here is not showing different species. So mule is not a different species, and I'll explain to you why. So you can see the horse and the donkey, and you can see that they have different amounts of chromosomes. So horse has 64 and the donkey has 62. So if they have gametes, there's 32 and 31, and that would give for the mule would be 63 chromosomes. So that means that the mule is infertile. So in the explanation of what a species is, a mule is not a separate species. So speciation happens when populations of the same species change enough to become reproductively isolated. So this means they can't interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So over time, a species will develop because of isolation from similar organisms. This next section is just for GCSE Biology. So you will need to know a bit more about speciation and also about this other biologist or naturalist at the time, Alfred Russel Wallace. He did independently propose the theory of evolution by natural selection. He actually sent some letters to Darwin and actually worked closely with Darwin in terms of developing those ideas. But he is also best known for his work, particularly on warning colours in mainly butterflies. So he looked at what we call mimicry and also speciation. So what are the mechanisms of speciation? Well, for GCSE Biology, you'll need to know what these are. And as it says here, populations of the same species can become isolated by a physical barrier. They can also get isolated by other types of barriers, but in this case, floods, earthquakes, or mountains. And as you can see in the diagram, you can get the development of different adaptations to their new environments, and over time, through mutations and natural selection, you get the development of a new species. And you'll know that they're different because even though they may look similar, they cannot produce fertile offspring, therefore they are different species. Okay, so let's have a look at some questions. So we're on a question checkpoint. There are quite a few questions in this section of work, so I'm going to go through a variety of questions with you. So again, as normal, I'd like you to pause, read and answer the questions, and then we'll go through them. So pause in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so fossils, they give evidence about organisms that lived a long time ago. Scientists have found very few fossils of the earliest life forms. Give one reason why, when there are many different reasons. So you could have mentioned that they were soft-bodied, or they lacked hard parts. Maybe they were eaten or decayed or destroyed, or even very small or buried deep. You could have had any of those answers. B says, suggest how the fossil in the photograph above was formed. Well, the fish would have been buried in sediment, sand or mud. Only the soft parts decayed, and therefore mineralization would occur, or you could say that the hard parts turn to stone. C, so okay, again, I'd like you to pause, read and answer these questions in 3, 2, 1. So it says the species of fish shown in the photograph is now extinct. Give 2 possible causes of extinction. So again, there are many answers here. So any 2 from drought, ice age, volcanic activity, global warming, asteroid, meteor strikes, new predators, new diseases, competition or habitat change. The next question asks, what is a mutation? Well, it is a change in a gene. And then E, describe the process of natural selection. And there are 3 marks available for this question. So you need to mention there's variation. You could mention there's a mutation. The better adapted survive. So you get, or you could say the survival of the fittest. Therefore, they pass on their alleles or genes. Okay, second question, I'd like you to pause, have a read and then answer. So in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so this is showing in the Grand Canyon, scientists have found fossils of several different groups of organisms. The diagram shows the number and age of the fossils. That's important in this question. The number and age of the fossils that the scientists found. The width of each shaded area shows the number of fossils found. So first question, what is a fossil? Quite straightforward. It's the remains of organisms found in rocks. Which group of organisms, A, B, C or D, was the first to evolve? Well, that would be the one that is the oldest in terms of the age of fossils, so that would be D. Which group is now extinct? Well, you can see that the one that is not at present day is group B. And then give 1 environmental factor that might have caused this group of organisms to become extinct. And again, there is a range of answers. So you could say there was global warming, climate change, ice age, maybe they were eaten by a predator, habitats have changed, anything of that kind. So again, I'd like you to have a read and try and answer these questions. So pause in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so scientists suggested that 10 million years ago, organisms of group C were more common than organisms from any of the other group. So what is the evidence? Well, basically, group C has the largest width, or it has the widest point, so therefore it has the highest numbers. And then, which of the following would provide the best evidence that their suggestion is correct? Well, basically, in terms of if they've evolved from a common ancestor, it would be that members of the group have similar physical characteristics. This question is a bit more involved. This is a higher tier question, and again, I'd like you to read it and pause and have a go. So in 3, 2, 1. So as you can see, they give you some information, and many of these types of exam questions on evolution, they will give you information you have never seen before. So they'll expect you to describe what you might be seeing. So they give you plenty of information, but it's really important to read the information. So the diagram shows changes in the foot bones of 4 ancestors of modern horses over the past 50 million years. And it says the shaded bones are the bones which touched the ground. So they're giving you a clue there. So it says, A, describe 2 changes to the bones in the feet of horses that have taken place over the past 50 million years. So you need to come up with 2 separate points. So any 2 from they are larger, longer or thicker, or they have fewer bones, or you can see that fewer bones are touching the ground. So any of those will do, any 2 of those. Then it says Eohippus lived in swampy areas with soft mud. Since this time, the ground in the habitat has become drier and harder. All of the horse ancestors were preyed upon by other animals. And it says one advantage to Eohippus of the arrangement of bones in its feet. Again, any 2 from the following. Well, it's got a large surface area, so more area touching the ground. That means there's a lower pressure, therefore less likely to sink. And they could run faster, so that means that they could get away from predators. So this is a 4-mark question, and it says the changes in the arrangements of the foot bone of horses supports Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. And it asks you to explain the arrangement of foot bones and how they could have evolved from Eohippus to Equus. Well, quite simply, it's just going through the points that I've mentioned earlier. So variation in the size and number of bones. So those with the fewer bones are more suited to running faster, so possibly on harder ground. These will survive and breed, and then genes, DNA or alleles will be passed on to their offspring. You might want to, in your answer, give more kind of specific description of Eohippus and Equus. So this next question is about speciation. It's definitely higher tier, and this is GCSE Biology. So what I'd like you to do again is to read it, pause, and see if you can answer it. So in 3, 2, 1. So it shows 2 different species of butterfly. So Amarimus and Hippolymus. Do you need to know that? Not necessarily, but you need to look at the colorations. Now, I know it's black and white, but you can see the general idea. So it says both species can be eaten by most birds. Amarimus has an unpleasant taste, which birds do not like. So birds have learned not to prey on it. Hippolymus does not have an unpleasant taste, but most birds do not prey on it. And it says, suggest why most birds do not prey on Hippolymus. And that's basically because wing pattern is similar. So the bird assumes, bird assumes it has an unpleasant taste, or it won't like it if it eats it, so it then avoids it. So suggest an explanation in terms of natural selection for the markings on the wings. Well, mutation produces similar wing pattern. The Hippolymus does not decide that it's going to have a similar patternation to Amarimus. It's a purely random mutation, and therefore it won't be eaten by the birds, and therefore that particular mutated organism will then breed and pass on those genes to their offspring, so more Hippolymus will look more and more like Amarimus. Okay, hope you found that very useful. It's quite a lot of information there. It's quite a big topic. I think the exam questions will be useful for you. So there is more videos on this unit coming shortly. So I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you soon.